Hello and welcome to the European Report. Here we are once again in the heart of Europe, here in the European Parliament, to discuss some of the major events that shaped 2013, in particular the EU's relationship towards Israel and the Middle East, and also we'll be doing a review of 2014 and asking what are some of the challenges facing the EU in 2014. I'm joined in this programme today by Timothy Kirkhope, MEP, Conservative MEP, Thomas Sandal, the founder and director for the European Coalition for Israel, and Ben Brugal, who is the European Parliamentary Liaison Department at the Israeli Embassy's mission to the EU. So, gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Timothy, it's good to have you back on the European Report. Can you explain some of the activities you've been involved here in the European Parliament over the last few months?
Well, I've been very busy, obviously, as a spokesman for my group on the Justice Committee, Home Affairs and Justice Committee. And we've had a massive number of issues going on, particularly relating to the use of data, private data, business data, whatever, data, where I think the Parliament has been showing its sort of its political allegiances and its general suspicions of authorities. And also, I have to say, its general sort of lack of respect for some countries, and I think particularly the United States, which has been getting quite a lot of trouble over the allegations that have been made about the so-called hacking and surveillance, and the arrival on the scene of people like Mr. Snowden, who appears to think it's okay to reveal a whole lot of confidential information which is so vital to our security. Mm-hmm. So clearly you'll understand where I'm coming from on that. I have condemned Mr. Snowden and those that support him, and I was very, very disappointed when later in the year the Sakharov Prize, which is a prize awarded by the Parliament for someone who's contributed to the peace of the world, that Mr. Snowden found himself in the last shortlist as a result of some of the political groups, thinking that he was a man that in some way had done a lot of good for the world, and I'm afraid I just don't agree about that. So we've had all that. We had a lot of data, as you know. We had immigration issues too, a lot of movement of people, ending at this time, at the end of the year, with the question of free movement and how important is free movement and what should it be subject to in terms of any kind of controls by various countries, including the United Kingdom.
So, incredibly important issues. And Thomas, I know that you and ECI have celebrated 10 years. Can you tell us some of the highlights over the last 10 years and some of the achievements that ECI have been able to achieve here in the European Parliament and also in the UN?
Thank you, Simon. Can I speak for the whole program, or I will make
Sadly
it?
Not, I'm afraid.
I will make it brief. We do often mention the Holocaust Remembrance Day, the fact that we initiated this event already in 2005, and it's now an official EU event. We've had a number of petitions for the 3 kidnapped Israeli soldiers, one which is alive and well today, Gilad Shalit, that we brought to Geneva with 40,000 signatures. We'd had another petition for a united Jerusalem with 60,000 signatures in 2011. And I should also mention an event which we did together with Timothy Kirkhope in 2011, when we, for the first time in this parliament, presented the legal foundations of Israel as it dates back to San Remo in 1920. So that was also one of the milestones that we've done with ECI. But 2 weeks ago, it was a very special week with this 10th anniversary, and now we're looking ahead for the next 10 years.
Excellent. And Ben, it's great to have you back on the European Report representing the State of Israel. Can you share some of the challenges and some of the diplomatic efforts that you've been working on over the last few months?
Thank you very much, Simon. It's very good to be here back. Actually, as you know, the EU and Israel have very extensive relations, but sometimes complicated ones. And I must say frankly that for the last few months, we're mainly busy dealing with bridging the gaps. We have a conceptual gap between the EU and Israel when it comes to our bilateral relation. While we see that our relation should be self-standing and based only on common interest, we see too often that our European partner put the Middle East conflict in the very center of our relations. A very good example of that, maybe a symptomatic one, was the publication of the guidelines last July, which put at stake the participation of Israel to Horizon 2020, and we're very happy that 2 weeks ago, eventually the two parties managed to come to terms and that Israel will be part of Horizon 2020.
And we are discussing some of the major news events of 2013. So Timothy, can you share with our viewers what you believe were some of the key news stories that have helped shape European policy towards Israel and the Middle East?
Well, I mean, certainly in the Middle East, we must obviously consider the ongoing problems in Syria, which really we've now had, I think, over 120,000 people have died in this situation. We've had some fairly unhealthy involvement of one or two other Middle East countries in that situation. Hasn't been helped by some of the interference that's been going on there. But nevertheless, it is a very dangerous situation, coupled with also the discussions latterly about Iran and its nuclear program. And I have to say that whilst, of course, I would welcome anything that effectively makes sure that the Iranian program does not continue. And I know that the sort of present sort of efforts, diplomatic efforts, seem to have reached some kind of advance. I do nevertheless continue to have serious concerns, because not only in relation to Iran itself, but also to a lot of the, shall we say, the people and organizations that Iran has historically linked onto, who are active in an unproductive or negative way elsewhere in the Middle East. It is a dangerous situation, and I think the major powers being involved like this is probably, on the one hand, good, the interests of the American president and the British Prime Minister, but at the same time, we have to be very, very careful, because we're handling something which has great complexities and where I think there are genuine fears. Israel, for instance, I think has every right to be concerned and fearful of the situation. And I think we therefore need greater assurances as we go into 2014. We need to keep an eye on this very carefully indeed to see that the agreement is performed. So, I mean, that has been a big issue looking at it during the course of the year. And as I said, the EU should be interested. The EU, or certainly the European Parliament, has never had a particularly positive view about Israel. I think you mentioned that. It just is the way things are here. But then they haven't got a particularly positive view, as I suggested earlier, about America either. There is a kind of natural sort of antipathy, shall I say.
Britain, we could say as well. And Ben, I know you mentioned the EU guidelines before, but what are some of the other issues that really Israel's faced in 2013 that have been a major challenge?
We had, of course, a series of issues when it comes to bilateral relations, but also global relation and cooperation of the EU. We had the pleasure to have the Open Skies Agreement signed between the EU and Israel, which will open the sky to all the European carriers coming to Israel, as well as Israeli carriers going to Europe. We had also a very positive signal sent from our European partners when the military branch of Hezbollah has been designated as a terrorist organization. We look forward for seeing more on that. We want more cooperation of that kind with our European partners. There was also a good signal sent very recently when the way of countries, the Western and like-minded countries, accepted Israel as a full-fledged member in the United Nations Human Rights Council. This sent a very strong signal to everyone. This said that Israel is one of you. Israel is part of Europe, Israel is part of the Western world, and this set a very strong signal for us as Israelis, and we think that also it sends a strong signal when it comes to the European countries. As mentioned, we're very concerned about the continuation of this linkage, of the fact that too many people, especially here in the European Parliament, refuse to talk about Israel, if not talking about the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And the irony of this situation is that Israel and Palestinians resume talks. For over 4 months, there are talks, discussions, peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians, and this has no effect whatsoever on the criticism on Israel. While we're trying to come to terms with the Palestinians, to find solutions, we hear more and more people here, unfortunately in the EU, trying to exert pressure on Israel, and maybe having a counterproductive role on this effect.
And Thomas, what were the challenges in 2013 for you and also for ECI in terms of news and how it's shaped the Middle East and EU relations?
Well, obviously, I live in the same world as Timothy and Ben, so I can't add very much to the situation that they described. As an organization and as a grassroots organization, you always have to pick your fight. I state from time to time that we are not a military agency. We are not necessarily really helpful in giving advice when it comes to Iran or what to do in Syria. But there are some issues where we can make an impact, and we have focused a lot on the EU guidelines, which were issued in July, and which we saw as very problematic from a number of perspectives. One being, of course, that they were issued in July, exactly when the European Parliament was going on recess. And of course also meaning that governments and parliaments across Europe were on holiday. So I think it contradicts the European values of transparency, of good governance, of dialogue and democracy. When something's as sensitive as the Middle East is being just thrown on the table when everyone are, preparing for a long holiday. So what we did, and it's still on the table, though there has been a deal made for Horizon 2020, we still believe it's important to make this point clear. We've done it in an open letter where we are protesting, if you wish, this whole initiative and say that it doesn't promote the peace process. It also contradicts the Oslo Accords. And we have to date 32 very prominent names from ministers from governments in the EU member states, former foreign ministers, and a number of members from this parliament who are on the same line. So I believe that also we who are not directly diplomats or members of these parliaments or EU officials, we have a role to play, but we have to pick our fights very carefully. And for us, these guidelines have been of a principled nature very important.
And in January 2013, we saw the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu secure a third term in office as Prime Minister. I'm going to go to you with this, Thomas. It's pretty historic that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has actually won 3 terms in office, so he's served 3 terms. What do you think his success is down to?
Well, I think in a region as in the Middle East, I often make this statement. I say the Middle East is not Scandinavia. We have to face it. The neighbors are more complicated than. I come from Finland, so we have to deal with Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And I think in a nation like Israel, you need a firm leader, and you need someone who may speak softly but carries a big stick, as Roosevelt said. And I think that Netanyahu gets this sense of respect throughout the region. And it's almost alarming, I think, today that if it wasn't for Netanyahu, it's not very clear who would be the next in line to take leadership. But again, I'm sure that Ben would have a better analysis on why Netanyahu is so popular. But what I wanted to say as a Christian perhaps is that what makes Netanyahu interesting is that he's a man of the book. And I think there hasn't been since Ben-Gurion's days someone who would quote from the Bible as often as he has done in his speeches to the UN General Assembly. And I think that builds a bridge to the Christian world, that we understand that here is someone who understands why he is in Israel, what are the rights for his people to be in Israel. And it's not flippy-floppy in any way. And I think, we appreciate that.
Yeah. And Ben, Israel is an incredibly vibrant democracy, the only true democracy in the Middle East, with democratic institutions such as a free press and a judiciary. These elections were kind of special in a way because security issues weren't the main issue that dominated the elections, and this is why I saw the rise of Yesh Atid, because it really focused on a lot on social and economic issues. Can you explain something about the vibrancy of Israel's democracy?
Exactly. Actually, you're totally right on that. We see an evolution during the last elections on the pattern of vote of the people, and especially actually under what people expected from their governance. Now the issue, the social issue, which were mainly flagged by Yesh Atid, were in all the political platforms, from the Likud, the right, to the left parties as well. It just reflects the fact that the Israeli society has come to a form of maturity. It requests more than only security issues. It's part, I would say, of the Zionist plan. We want to have a home, of course, but we want this home to be fit to the people who live within it. And that's part now of the dialogue, of the debate in Israel. You see more new people in this Knesset, but you see the same parties and new parties, but the main idea is that everyone needs to address social issues. And we see it as something very positive from all the political groups.
Yeah. And Timothy, Israel very much shares European values. Yeah. It is really the only beacon of light in what is becoming a very dark and dangerous region. It has an incredibly vibrant democracy. Why is the EU reluctant to recognise this and purely focusing on the expansion of Jewish homes at the expense of everything else that's going on in the Middle East?
Oh, I think, actually, first of all, I would acknowledge, by the way, the democracy in Israel, and that's one of its problems. I mean, democracy is a wonderful thing, but Israel has taken it to a fine art. You know, the number of political parties and the kind of wheeler dealing that goes on all the time in terms of, you know, whenever there's an election, whenever the government is to be formed. I think my compliment to Mr. Netanyahu would be that he has managed to control things for 3 terms in a sort of situation that we in the UK, for instance, even with our coalition issues, don't have to face. So I think I congratulate him enormously on that. Why is it that people here are so hostile? I don't know. I mean, I think it's true to say that in terms of the lobbying that goes on here and has been around the place, there is a strong Arabist, strong Palestinian lobbying process here. There is undoubtedly, of course, the contrast between the democratic state, which ought to be given full value and you know, it ought to be congratulated, but in fact, because it is a democratic state, because it is also comparatively rich in many ways, Israel has great riches, and its economy and all the rest of it is showing considerable vibrancy and success. In many ways, people here, I suppose, are looking at the plight of some of the Palestinians who have chosen the sort of government that is never going to give them the riches and prosperity and a happy life, you know. And they say, well, we must step in and we must put in the balance here to support these poorer people or whatever it is. You know, I just think that's the way sometimes this parliament works, particularly some of the political groups on the left who've got this great thing. And because Israel is, this is the irony, a real irony, because Israel is successful, because Israel is prosperous, because Israel is so democratic, it's paying a very high price for it in the eyes of some of the politicians here.
And one of the other major news stories that dominated 2013 was the Syrian civil war that has cost the life so far of over 125,000 Syrians and created a refugee crisis of 2.2 million. Timothy, I'm going to ask you first, really. I know that David Cameron, your leader of the Conservative Party and also our Prime Minister, took to Parliament. Particularly took to Parliament, it was going to suggest to Parliament that the West intervene in terms of military action after the UN findings that Assad's forces had used chemical and biological weapons against their own people. Do you believe that this was a mistake, or should Britain stay out of any military confrontation to try and resolve this conflict?
It's perfectly true that the United Kingdom was part of a group of nations that had looked at the option of some form of military intervention because of the revelations regarding chemical weapons. I'm actually quite pleased that we managed to reach a different situation on that, because I do think that military intervention would have been very difficult. It would also not necessarily have made matters any easier in terms of getting an ultimate peace settlement there and so on. And for surrounding countries, I think there would have been great concern about it. So I'm not criticizing the way they were going, because I think that there was undoubtedly an absolute outrage and I think rightly so, for the fact that chemical weapons had been used. But the trouble was, in a chaotic situation where you have a number of groups that are opposed to the present leadership, where you have effectively a type of civil war going on, it's not always easy to be quite sure about who has been responsible for the use of chemical weapons or in what way. And it does appear to be regime, but again, I think there were some doubts, and I think probably the Prime Minister had doubts too in the end. And I think maybe this process that we have now, at least with the regime agreeing to their weapons being internationally disposed of, does seem to me to have been a sensible approach.
And Thomas, the situation in Syria is incredibly complex, primarily because you've got over 150 Iranian troops, members of the Revolutionary Guards, also the Basijis, and also Hezbollah propping up Assad's regime. And then with the rebels, you've got strong elements within Al-Qaeda, and mixed up in this group of the Christians who face incredible persecution. What do you think are the long-term solutions to bring about a resolution to this bloody conflict in Syria?
You got me on that one. It's obviously it's very complex. What I would like to say before I would even tend to hint at a solution is, again, a double standard that we see in the West and perhaps in this House as well. It's interesting when you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and you see if there are, if there's an escalation and people get killed, of course it's always a tragedy. But when you then look at what has happened over the last 1 year, 2 years in Syria, you mentioned the numbers, 120,000 killed, many of them civilians, many of them Palestinians. One would have to ask the question, if our primary concern is a concern for the Palestinian people, which I believe is a good concern, why hasn't there been stronger reactions in this parliament, in the EU governments, and on the streets of Europe? So there's something which for me is very disturbing, this imbalance when it comes to conflict and conflict, when it comes to suffering and suffering. And will be very difficult for certain groups in this parliament to explain, why is it that what happens in Syria is of little concern for them. And I think also because we hear less about Syria right now, and we tend to be happy that we could strike a deal and things are a bit more quiet. But I think it was Hannu Takkula who said in this program a few months ago, well, what about, was that really the decisive factor? What if another 100,000 will die? Will it be less urgent simply because chemical or biological weapons have not been used? So I think these are questions we need to raise. As to solutions, obviously that's very complex. I believe, contrary to George W. Bush, that it's not just a matter of, coming in with cavalry and everything is sorted out. We saw what happened in Iraq. I believe we are talking about generations in this region before you can develop a culture of democracy, a culture which can produce parliamentary democracy. So it's a long road ahead, but we have to, take these baby steps, and I think it starts with really realizing, where the core of the problem is.
And Ben, the security up in the Golan Heights between Israel and Syria has been pretty peaceful over the last 40 years, particularly since the end of the Yom Kippur War. What are Israel's security concerns with Iran's involvement in the civil war in Syria, and also the mass build-up of Hezbollah forces in Syria as well as in Lebanon?
Yes, Simon, if you allow me, before elaborating on the merits of the various parties involved in the conflict, please just let me state that what happens in Syria, for our point of view, the slaughter of over 100,000 civilians by the Syrian forces is something outrageous. As Israelis, as human beings, it's against all our principles. And that's something that needs to be stated. Israel provides humanitarian assistance where it can. Unfortunately, the neighboring country often refuses us to convey the assistance. What is being done at this stage, and that's not a secret for anyone, is that Israel accepts within its territory wounded civilians coming from Syria, sometimes even fighters, without looking into who are those people, give them medical treatment and bring them back. That's our modest contribution, but whatever we can do to help, we would be very happy to do that because it's just unacceptable from our point of view. Now, when it comes to the situation in Syria, well, let me be frank with you. It's very worrisome. What we see in Syria is very worrisome from our point of view. The presence of Hezbollah in the Golan Heights is not going to bring stability. The presence of jihadist fighters is not going to help us neither. There are too many skirmishes, too many incidents in which you have fire turned against Israeli targets, be they civilian or military targets in the Golan Heights. And what we can do at this stage, we're not part of this conflict, and trust me, no one in Israel wants to be part of this conflict, is to stand firm and to brace for any scenario. We don't know what's going to happen, but we'll have to be ready in case the situation would deteriorate.
And one country, of course, that we haven't mentioned in this context yet is Russia. And Russia's involvement and Russia's support for the regime in Syria and the way in which they have behaved, I think is something which I would be critical of. I do criticize them, and I think that more and more we're seeing, and something in this parliament too, that the role of Russia, is Russia going to be a responsible player in the future on the world scene, or is it going to be bringing back the nasty days, as it were, when it caused quite a lot of trouble? I'm not sure. I'm just not very confident about it.
Well, so that's one we have to watch. I think there has been a strong strategic relationship between the former Soviet Union and Syria that really goes back to the 70s, if not before. The other issue we're going to be discussing that was major in 2013 was the agreement between the 5+1 Western nations of the UN Security Council and Iran, coming to an interim agreement for 6 months on Iran's nuclear agreement. Timothy, I ask you, how can we ensure that the US and the EU ensure that Iran keep to this interim agreement to actually stop them becoming a military nuclear power?
Well, I mean, the points have been put very clearly by those who've negotiated this, that it is a tough agreement. That actually, if it is adhered to in every way by the Iranians, then it is a very good start, and that we will get, at the end of it, a much more comprehensive agreement which will deal with the matter. My questions are that in this 6-month period, we have to make absolutely sure that we monitor closely everything that is going on here. Because I know inspection teams can be formed and can do their business and so on. But I have an old sort of thought, going back many, many years, that you have to go just a little bit behind that and keep a close eye on things. I would imagine that people nearby in Iran, I think Israel as well, will be keeping a close eye on how things are going here, because their concerns are obvious. But I do think we really do need to keep this one going in the right direction. And when we come to comprehensive discussions, if we get to those in 6 months' time, then those comprehensive discussions, I think, have got to really deal ultimately with the issue of the ability of the Iranians with regard to uranium and production and so on. We've got to really be quite careful. So, I mean, I'm not against the decision. I do know that Israel is not happy with it, but I think myself that if it's carefully monitored, then it is some progress.
And Thomas, would you say that this new interim agreement, also known as the Geneva Agreement, will actually halt Iran's nuclear weapons program, or it would be considered to be a peace in our time agreement, looking back?
Well, I've said it many times in this program before that I'm rather skeptical when it comes to the true intentions of the so-called new moderate Iranian regime. Interestingly, I just came from Geneva yesterday, and I'll be going to New York next week. And we were in New York when Rouhani was there at the UN General Assembly, And when things sort of changed completely and there was this new sort of rapprochement between the US and Iran. And I mean, this is an issue where I really hope that I'm completely wrong, and I'd be most happy to acknowledge later on that I was wrong. But I can't help but be skeptical as we saw the same week as the leaders were meeting in Iran. We heard statements from the supreme leader in Tehran, again speaking about Israel as a rabid dog and something that needs to be annihilated and wiped. He didn't say wiped off the map, but he used similar language. So and as all of us know, it's you may have negotiators who can speak English and are trained in the best universities in Britain. It doesn't change the motivation of the supreme leader in Iran. And what I said a few programs ago, I said, you know, you can see if Iran really wants to buy time, what better way would it be to buy time to put up a happy face? And again, I hope I'm wrong, but I have my sincere doubts about the deal that was made.
And Ben, the Islamic Republic of Iran poses an existential threat to your nation. We've had leaders like Ahmadinejad, even the supreme leader, call for the destruction of the state of Israel and the Jewish people worldwide. Iran is also the world's leading state sponsor of international terrorism and a horrendous abuser of human rights. What are the dangers for Israel and the Middle East if Iran becomes a military nuclear power?
Well, first of all, I'd like to state that Iran is a danger for Israel, but it's a danger also for the Arab countries in the region and even for Europe. Iran developed long-range missiles not to strike Israel, but to strike targets way beyond Israel, some in Europe. So actually, I would say that we're in the same boat when it comes to Iran and the danger that it brings. Well, a nuclear Iran would make the Middle East a much more dangerous place. It will embolden the radical elements, Hezbollah, Hamas and others. It will help also the Assad regime, and it will lead to an arms race. We know that some countries already consider the possibility to develop their own nuclear program. That would be a reason for concern for all of us. A nuclear Iran would be a catastrophe for all the world, and that's maybe, from our point of view, we can't afford to be wrong in the agreement. And as you said, Israel is a bit more than skeptical when it comes to this agreement that has been signed in Geneva, because we don't see any change in Iran. We consider it to be a tactical move. At this stage, Iran is a threshold country. They could decide at any point to resume their activities. And the question is, once you alleviated sanctions, how long would it take to the international community to resume sanctions and to impose new sanctions on Iran? We are very concerned.
I think that's a good point, of course, and that is that if we are lifting some sanctions, which we are saying we're doing because of this initial agreement, I think we've got to make absolutely sure that if the agreement is not adhered to totally by Iran, then that these sanctions can be reapplied or will be reapplied without any delays. Because undoubtedly the sanctions have had some effect on Iran, but because of the nature of the regime itself, its attitude, I mean, the human rights issues are another matter, of course. But because of that attitude, then sanctions, unless they are heavy sanctions, would not have necessarily the desired effect. And lifting off some of these critical ones now, I'm sure that was part of the deal, of course. But they have to be reapplied if it is not adhered to, and that must be clear.
I know that, you, Timothy, you've got to go shortly, but next year, 2014, is a very important year for you. You're up for re-election, and just encourage our viewers who are based in Yorkshire and the Humber to actually vote for you.
Certainly to vote.
Absolutely. But what do you think some of the challenges that you personally face here and the Parliament faces in 2014?
Well, I mean, as far as Europe is concerned, I mean, Europe has always been at a crossroads, as long as I can remember politics, really. It certainly is at a crossroads now, because it has reached a certain size. With all these countries now, members, a lot of those countries came from a background of repression, of control by others, particularly the ones in the Baltic states and Central and Eastern Europe. We've got the issue regarding who else should become a member? You know, what are we going to be doing here? Talking to sort of Croatia, obviously there. We've seen what's happened with Ukraine and the Russian influence stopping Ukraine from having closer relations with Europe. What kind of European Union are we going to have? Is it going to be a European Union which is actually, you know, far more a sort of single body, or is it going to be, as obviously I would like and my party would like, a European Union which concentrates on the big trade issues, the competition of the world lying ahead with China and India and so on? And is it that kind of Europe? Is it the sort of Europe where we're going to make people better educated? We're going to actually make sure that we are really going to be able to survive in this very tough world we're in now. I think that's what we should be looking for. So I want to see a very reformist agenda. I think we've seen signs of it from the Commission. Obviously, I and my colleagues fight for that. That's what I want to see in 2014, and I would hope that the elections themselves, when they take place, will return people of that sort of opinion. You know, it's a good, the European Union, to my mind, is a good thing, but it needs a lot of change, a lot of reform, and it also needs some of its ambitions held back so that we look at what really matters and what makes people successful and happy.
Timothy, I know you have to leave us now, so I want to thank you and wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and thank you for your bold and courageous stance that you're making here in the European Parliament.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Timothy Kirkhope, MEP, has left us. He's had to go back to London, so we're going to carry on our discussion looking at some of the key events that have shaped 2013 in terms of the EU, Israel and the Middle East. I think we need to just talk a little bit about Iran and this new deal, primarily because this new interim agreement doesn't stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons and becoming a nuclear military power, and certainly punches a major hole in their economic sanctions at a time when Iran is on the verge of economic collapse. Has the Western world lost its moral nerve and moral compass in confronting and dealing with the threat of nuclear Iran?
Yes, you're raising a number of interesting issues, and so have other analysts over the last few weeks after the, 2 weeks after the deal. And I read interesting journalist Brett Stevens in Wall Street Journal, who made the, he was actually making a comparison with Munich, and he said they actually got a better deal in Munich than they got in Geneva. And he was explaining and said at that point, because we often talk about Munich as something, it is appeasement, but it was also, I think, some element of tactical considerations that the Allies needed more time to rearm in order to go into the war. So comparing with what happened in Geneva, Brett Stevens makes the point to say, well, the Western world and you know, Russia and the international community basically got nothing. And as you indicated, you know, this should have been the time. Iran was already suffering from all the sanctions. This would have been the time to pressure them further, because we could have gotten a better deal. So I am still very concerned about the outcome, and I think also in the region, apart from Israel, and it's of course an interesting situation with Saudi Arabia and Israel would agree on an issue, and this is where they agree, because I think there is a feeling in the Middle East among the allies of the Western world that the Western world have lost some of its courage and steadfastness when it comes to standing up to terror. And of course, you know, looking at Europe, you know, none of us wants sanctions that would affect our economies. None of us would want to see another war. It's true. I don't want that. But it also means that we are playing in the hands of those who do not have any doubts in, you know, playing with the highest possible risk in this international game.
And Ben, isn't one of the major concerns, not only for Israel, but in terms of the EU and the United States, in terms of this agreement with Iran, is that they've looked at the nuclear weapon issue, put that aside, but haven't addressed the ideological motivation behind the regime, this messianic Shia Islamic extremism that is driving them and pushing them through so that Iran can be in a position where they can actually dominate the region.
Absolutely, absolutely, Simon. Actually, the agreement, as we understand it, the best case scenario deals with the means, but doesn't deal with the motivation. And the motivation is a very big part of the problem. As long as you will have people in Tehran voting for the destruction of the state of Israel or calling for the destruction of anything else, endangering all the neighboring countries and developing hegemonic views, then no one will be safe and secure in the Middle East. And that's part of the problem as well, that this has not been addressed, and this is not going to be addressed as far as we understand it. A deal would need also commitment from Iran in this field, in the field of human rights, and also in the field of the peaceful intention of Iran in the region. We will have to get assurances that in the future, Iran will not resume any action of that kind, any aggressive policy. And that's part.
I think, Simon, just looking back in time, maybe it was so that the Western world really lost its opportunity when there was an uprising in Iran, before the Arab Spring. And, you know, when we look back and say, well, why didn't the American president act stronger? Why did not the European Union come on board and support the opposition? They were just looking at the sidelines. But when we had the new situation then in Tunisia or Libya or Egypt, then they were so eager to encourage these forces that then turn out to be much worse than those who had been in power before. So maybe the solution would have been several years back if we had acted wisely and decisively at that point.
Absolutely. And the other major issue that shaped the Middle East in 2013 was the fact that 30 million plus Egyptians took to the streets to force the Muslim Brotherhood President Morsi from power, together with General Sisi and the military. Firstly, what happened, Thomas, in Egypt has been absolutely incredible. I mean, 30+ million people taking to the streets of Egypt to demand that President Morsi resign from his office. And this was instigated by the General Sisi. Are Egyptians waking up to the danger of radical Islamism?
I think they are, and it happened very quickly, you know, and it's interesting to see the first enthusiasm, not only in Egypt, but in this building and in Brussels, to say that, you know, this is a wonderful new season of reforms, and spring in the Middle East is going to be all wonderful. But very quickly, of course, we saw the true nature of the same forces, the same ideology that we see in Tehran and elsewhere in the region. And I think what is needed in the Western world, including in the European Union, is the courage really to confront or realize, you know, that there's something fundamentally wrong in the region that we cannot tolerate. We cannot tolerate and put up a happy smile when a regime is saying publicly in the United Nations that, you know, this nation, Israel, will be wiped off the map. It's a rabient dog. You know, this is the language of dictators, and this is where we should demand a clearer stand from the High Representative Catherine Ashton. And I've said it time and time again, because now we hear these nonsense, sorry my French, that, you know, settlements, the obstacles to peace, settlements, the obstacles to peace. She need to be much clearer in saying that our best friend in the Middle East is Israel. The only state that is sharing our values in that region is Israel, and we should make sure that Israel is being kept stable, the only stable country in that whole region, and stop to meddle in the domestic issues of this democracy.
And Ben, we're so pleased that the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement has managed to survive despite the incredible political upheaval and the social upheaval and the violence that we're seeing in Egypt. How important is Israel's peace agreement with Jordan and Egypt, respectively?
Well, both of them, both peace treaties are strategic assets for Israel. They are very important to our security. And one of the most important things for us is to see that the peace treaty with Egypt, which has been a test during the last years, is surviving and is doing well. We can't choose the leader for our neighbors. We won't decide who needs to be the president of Egypt. What is important for us is to know that whomever is president in Egypt, he will remain committed to the peace treaty with Israel. He will understand that there is no alternative to peace and that any degradation of this agreement to lead to catastrophe as well. What we will need also is to hear strong statements from European leaders in that sense, to make sure that when they meet with their Egyptian counterpart, they remind them how important the peace treaty is, also from a European point of view. That could be very productive and that could give the European Union a very, very positive role in this sense.
And Thomas, the other issue I want to bring up is very, very important. It's linked to this. I mean, we're approaching Christmas, and as Christmas, we remember the Christian communities in the Middle East. Now, let's not forget that back in August, that the Christian Copts and evangelical Christians faced their own Krishtonat, where over 68 churches, monasteries, Christian bookshops were burnt down and destroyed by the supporters of President Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood. And yet there was virtually no international condemnation by the EU, by Britain or by the US, and very little media coverage on this issue. Why is it when we're seeing the persecution of these ancient Christian communities that the international community is so quiet?
Again, Simon, it's one of those questions that you just wish you had the answers for. Maybe if I'm a bit ironic, it's 10 years from now, people will start discussing, well, what happened 10 years ago? Wasn't that awful? And the problem, of course, is that we do not react in time. Maybe it is so that in the Western world, you tend to think about Christian communities as communities which are majority. They have the means, they have the privileges, and you don't realize that globally speaking, Christianity looks very different. It's more black than it's white. There are more people in the southern hemisphere than there are in the northern hemisphere, and the situation that the Copts and other Christians are facing in Egypt is quite similar to what Christians are facing in many other parts of the world, but we hear very little about it. So it's maybe a sense of bad conscience of all the things that have been done in the name of Western civilization / Christianity in the past, that you cannot talk about these things now. I know there are people like Patrick Socadeo in Britain who say this is an expression of racism, because the Christians who are suffering, they're not the Europeans, they're not the blue-eyed, blonde people, but it's people of color. They're people who sometimes we are not able to identify with, but it's a tragedy nevertheless.
And Ben, sadly, we've seen over the last 60 years the real ethnic cleansing of the Jewish people from the Arab world and the Middle East, where Israel absorbed over 850,000 Jewish Arab refugees. What is your take on the persecutions of Christians in the Middle East?
I would say it very briefly. That's an outrage. That's something that we could never accept and that we do not accept. It's very dreadful, and we know where it comes from as well. From the same sources, from the same people who would like to see us out of the Middle East. We see that the situation of the Christian for us reminds us of what would be our fate should those people take over in the region. And we cannot sympathize, especially in this period of Christmas and Hanukkah for ourselves, with the Christians in the Middle East.
And Ben, finally, on the last issues we're going to discuss, what are the challenges facing the State of Israel in terms of relationships with the EU in 2014?
If you allow me to address a wish list before Christmas of Hanukkah, then in our point of view, a good 2014 would be a 2014 without linkage, a 2014 with an upgrade of the relation between Israel and the EU. You might know that since 2008, the EU refuses to upgrade the relation since the blockade, the military operation in Gaza, and the signature of Horizon 2020 for us could be a good opportunity to go further, to overcome what the gaps that we have to cope with at this stage and to have a better year. It would be also a year of cooperation in the international arena with the Palestinians on the Syrian issue, on all the other issues. We would like to see better communication and better relation in general with the European Union.
And Thomas, what do you think the challenges are facing Israel, the EU and the Middle East in 2014?
Well, talking about Europe for a few minutes, we have the elections, as Timothy said, and I think we need to be aware of the fact that what has happened in Europe over the last perhaps 1-2 years is a very dangerous rise of anti-Semitism and racism and xenophobia, where parties that you never thought would be in parliaments in countries like Hungary, Bulgaria, Greece, you name it, are growing stronger, which means that next summer you may have a serious increase of these radical elements here in this European Parliament. And we just have to make sure that people are very active in the European elections, that they can vote in people who are sensible, people who have the right values, and that Europe does not go even further in the wrong direction. Again, my wish list, of course, we world peace, and I believe, as the saying goes, when there's peace in Jerusalem, there's peace in the world. So we ought to pray for the peace of Jerusalem.
Absolutely. And Ben, how can the Christian community, those Christians who have a love and a passion for Israel, stand with Israel more in 2014?
Actually, first of all, you give me the opportunity to thank you for your support. Trust me, it might be sometimes challenging to be here in Europe and to stand for Israel. And we know how uneasy it can be for you to support us. We know, because we have to support ourselves, and it's not so easy. Please just continue being with us. Listen to us. We don't have to agree on everything, of course, but to continue to have that type of communication as we have now, we're very happy with that, and it gives us a lot of strength to continue the fight and to be on the map and to have better relations.
And finally, Thomas, what are the challenges and what are the opportunities facing the European Coalition for Israel in 2014? Hopefully we're still doing a European report.
Yes, next year, of course, will be a bit different when people start to leave Brussels already in March, April, and prepare for their re-election campaigns. But we will continue to work on these guidelines to bring up the issues on how also the European Union needs to respect the Oslo Accords, and how they cannot, it's not in their power to predetermine the border of potentially a future Palestinian state. And this is something that we need to challenge on legal grounds, and this is what we will continue to do together with Ben and together with others here in Brussels. So I expect that next year will be a good year.
So, gentlemen, I just want to thank you for joining me today on this special news review of 2013 on the European Report here in the European Parliament. And I want to thank you for all watching at home. We just want to wish you all a happy Christmas and a blessed New Year. And may God touch you in 2014 in new ways. And it's important that here we are in the European Parliament, which is in the heart of the EU, that we make a real stand for Israel and the Jewish people, and we bring clarity to what's happening in the Middle East, so that we can be voices of hope and support those forces of freedom and liberty in what's becoming a very dark and dangerous region. And so now is the time to really show our strong support for those forces of democracy and freedom by supporting Israel as she faces many challenges in 2014. So thank you for watching today's European Report.